To our last speaker for this conference, actually. If you look to the program book, then you read that our next speaker, he's a placademic. I'm not sure if you read that, and I read it, and I'm wondering what's a placademic. But we know the following speaker pretty well. He's a very enthusiastic member of the Council on Tall Buildings. He's a member of the editorial board of the journal, many other things. And I'm thinking, okay, this person, he's very professional at what he does, so that's the P. He's also a lecturer, that's the L, and he's an academic. So if you glue that all together, then you get the placademic, and I think it's just an excellent creative example of how much density this person can create, and actually he's doing so throughout his academic career. He's going to tell us actually on the topic, on the context of Singapore, where a lot of density and a lot of creativity is needed to make it livable. I would like to welcome to the stage Jason Pomeroy.
Thank you for those kind words of introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a long day, I'm sure, so I'll try and keep this as short, sharp, and swift. What I'm going to be talking about is greening the urban habitat, but in a slightly more quantifiable way. I'll be looking at the green plot ratio, which is an opportunity for us to actually start to quantify, using a biological measure, the leaf area index, quantums of greenery in open space. Space being the key word here, because as Anthony kindly highlighted earlier, the importance of being able to foster greater communal environments, social communities, and also the provider of natural light and ventilation being in space is pretty key. It is also space that allows us to actually be able to plant anyway. I'm now living in Singapore, but I'm actually from the UK originally. Singapore is certainly a high-density urban environment, and we see many an Asian city going in that way. But when you look at these figure ground diagrams from the 18th century, be that in Rome here, or through to the 19th century of Barcelona, or the 20th century of Portland, or even the 21st century of Singapore, what we see is the gradual eradication of those open white spaces. The white spaces that were once so intrinsic to our social interaction, our meeting and greeting, our means of movement through the city. Similarly, with the depletion of those open spaces, we're seeing the gradual eradication of those green spaces. Once upon a time, the green lungs of our city that will allow us to have more communal environments and to be able to have shade and shelter are gradually being eroded away. So should we not be exploring alternative ways of greening our urban habitat that can foster a sense of community whilst combating negative environmental impacts associated with urban densification? So let us consider the loss of open space and the socio-environmental impacts. As I'm sure you're all aware of the urban heat island effect, and what we see is that with the loss of green open spaces, we are seeing increasing rise to urban heat island effect and its other negative environmental impacts. But at the same time, we're seeing huge social implications. The opportunities that were once for us to be able to socially interact in public in these open spaces are slowly being eradicated. I guess the modern city of objects, those gas-guzzling behemoths that we see in so many a city, be that Tokyo or Hong Kong or Singapore, is certainly also seeing the reduction in urban greenery. The negative impacts of that, as I've just mentioned, is the gradual rise in urban temperatures. Urban heat island effect can be defined as the temperature differential between the rural and the urban habitat. And then when you think about the human amplification of high density, highly serviced buildings and the anthropogenic sources of heat, be that via the automobile or the air conditioning system or the harder surfaces within our urban habitat, it leads naturally to those cataclysmic effects of climate change and UHI. Professor Wong Nyuk Hen of the University of Singapore clearly demonstrates this in his study of Singapore. What you see at the center of Singapore is the central business district, and then as you move towards the west, you have the industry, and as you move towards the east, you've got Changi Airport. You see temperature spikes taking place in the central business district, and you also see temperature spikes in the airport areas where there are actually harder surfaces. Also in the industrial areas where there is a huge expanse of sort of metal roofs. Interestingly enough, the residential areas actually have the cooler temperatures given the expanse of the green open spaces for the residents to enjoy. But in addition to the removal of the greenery and in addition to the removal of the space, we also see the compromising of certain social and spatial mechanisms. The consequence of that deficit in open space is the loss of communal activity. Once upon a time, we used to be able to wash in the street or even play in the street. So what this means is that we're increasingly having to find alternative social spaces for social interaction, as well as a means of environmental improvement. After all, it is the space that provides natural light and ventilation. It provides certain socio-economic benefits and ecological benefits for which we will see in a few case studies. As I mentioned, we see that replenishment of the open spaces in our urban habitats today, and one can see that particularly in the form of the skycourt and the skygarden within these increasing hybrid structures that are taking place around the world. One could argue that if in the 18th century the court was a social space that was an opportunity for philanthropists to give back to civil society, or even the 19th century arcade, then perhaps in the 21st century we're seeing an increasing quantum of skycourts and skygardens being given back, if you will, for social means and civil society to enjoy. Skycourts can be spatially defined as those interstitial spaces that take place within buildings that balance the open space of built-up area ratios within the tall building. And actually, when they're placed at the top of the building, they can also be certain income-generating opportunities as well. What we see in the form of the skycourt and the skygarden is the fact that they start to balance some of the loss of open spaces that were once so intrinsic to our day-to-day activity in the street and the square. In Singapore in particular, whereby the temperatures can be quite high, we see lots of people running to the shopping mall to enjoy their 18 degrees centigrade of retail mall temperatures. But increasingly we're seeing similar flocks heading towards the skycourt and the skygarden in addition to those subterranean places. I think it is quite important to note, though, that in the case of Singapore, there are certain incentives. Singapore has taken measures to legislate the incorporation of skycourts, as can be seen in Singapore Urban Development Authority Circular 2009, whereby revised GFA exemption criteria for skycourts and sky terraces encourage more attractive communal spaces and greater provision of planting. Ultimately, developers are encouraged to incorporate skycourts and skygardens and actually can get exemption for GFA, thus being able to build more. All of this for the betterment of the building occupants. We see this in some particular examples in Singapore. The National Library demonstrates the socio-environmental properties. Oh dear, excuse me. I don't think we'll install any item today. It actually has 16 stories. It's a state-of-the-art facility. I guess it is questionable whether it is actually a tall building. But then again, when you look at the context of the environment, it's about 5 to 6 in the region. But what is quite curious is that it has 2 main sky gardens, 6,300 square meters of designated green space in total. That provides an opportunity for good quality light to be able to come in, and also ventilation for those who want to actually study outside, as you can see with these students here. As Anthony highlighted earlier, Commerzbank, a prime opportunity to see how you can start to integrate skycourts within an office building to actually foster a greater sense of workplace community and also enhance productivity. 4-story skycourts rotate every 4 stories up and around the building to create essentially village squares. The Shard in London Bridge, 72 stories, that will be the tallest mixed-use structure in Europe. It has 3-story mid-level skycourts that will house retail, bars, restaurants, leisure and performance activities, ultimately acting like a spatial gel, gluing disparate facilities together for the interaction of the occupants. And as Renzo Piano describes it, it's a small vertical town for about 7,000 people to work in and enjoy. And let us not forget the Marina Bay Sands in Singapore. At 1.2 hectares of a sky park, it's quite colossal. But it is also an income-generating opportunity, as one wants to be able to kind of get a view over the Singapore skyline, and it generates about 80,000 Sing dollars per day. Though I do not fancy anybody trying to swim to the edge. It is slightly scary. What these examples demonstrate is a new hybrid that balances space within the object, opportunities for natural light and ventilation, opportunities for social interaction, opportunities for an ease of movement. But at this current point in time, there are some fundamental issues. They are not public spaces. For the best will in the world, we want them to be. We want them to have the characteristics of the public domain that we see on the ground. We have got a long way to go. But yet again, they do have certain public domain characteristics, opportunities for us to interact. And it's generally the public side, in terms of the library, that is actually having a greater opportunity for those open spaces to be incorporated in them. Singapore is faced with significant issues, urban heat island effect, as well as a rising population that from 5 million people will be 6 billion by 2020. So the importance of being able to balance space and as well as greenery within these hybrid structures is coming to the fore in examples like the Pinnacle at Duxton, a residential complex, Newton Suites, and the Marina Bay Sands. So what of the green plot ratio, and how does this sort of tie into the whole idea of skycourts and sky gardens? Well, what we need to bear in mind is that greenery doesn't just exist on the horizontal plane, it's also the vertical and the diagonal. Similarly, we're increasingly seeing the incorporation of greenery on those vertical, diagonal, and horizontal planes. We only have to look at Chicago, for instance, and see how the 2.5 million square feet of rooftop greenery has been able to reduce ambient temperatures by between 1 and 4 degrees centigrade through the ethos of Mayor Daley. So increasingly, the incorporation of urban greenery is certainly helping us control those ambient temperatures. This was something that the Singapore government were particularly keen to try and explore. The idea of being able to quantify the greenery, to be able to understand what the properties of that greenery are, whether that's sort of water retention or carbon sequestration or the ability to reduce ambient temperatures. Grass, shrubs, palms and trees, they all have different leaf area indexes. They all have a different area of greenery. And so when you look at a shrub which actually has quite a lot of density, it actually has greater water retention and urban sort of ambient temperature reduction properties over, say, a sparse palm tree. This led us to a review of 100 buildings and their landscape sites within Singapore, looking at the residential, industrial and commercial centres, and allowed us to then start to categorise the different types of urban greenery, be that green walls or planter boxes, which allowed us to eventually get to a kit of parts, a 1 square metre kit of parts that each had its own leaf area index and own biological measures, each quantified per square metre. What this allowed us to do was then to apply this across the horizontal, diagonal and vertical surfaces of tall buildings in order to look at how it could mitigate glare, how to mitigate ambient temperatures rising, and also to actually try and improve the thermal performance of the building. It also allowed us to start to quantify the incorporation of greenery, be that from just the horizontal plane to then densifying the greenery, placing it on the rooftop, placing it on the surfaces, or even cutting in skycourts and sky gardens for further social and economic opportunities. This is something that we're now applying to buildings, and it's, I guess, quite apt that this section is on sort of compact and green. This is not a tall building. This is actually a bit of a baby. It's only 12 stories in height, quite compact. It's a site in Kuala Lumpur, to be precise, a place called Taman Tun Dr. Ismail. And the site was originally a greenfield site which had a green plot ratio of 1.13. So we added up the quantum of trees and palms on the surface, and you basically add up the leaf area index and you divide it by the site area to give you the green plot ratio. Given the planning, economic and spatial constraints, it drove the building into a slightly more extruded cube. What was quite curious about the building program, though, is that it's actually a very, very mixed use and compact building. workplace, hospitality, retail, lifestyle, arts and leisure all come together in this building. And somewhat sort of metaphorical, it actually responds to the 6 sides of a cube. It allowed us to then explore the idea of unpacking that cube, which could then also help inform the facades by thermally mapping the facades in order to be able to position the greenery. This compact form allowed us to start to cut a series of voids for the opportunity to draw in natural ventilation and natural light. The mixed-use program of those 6 disparate functions were then strategically placed, and a skin was wrapped around the surface that would then allow us to cut further holes and apply a series of green panels and extruded mesh that would almost be mapping out the thermal performance of the building. So the idea to try and look at vertical greenery as a environmental skin, if you will, allowed us to move forward to look at the different leaf area indexes of different types of vertical planting. Some are actually far more dense, which would be ideal for areas whereby there is a greater amount of solar heat gain, be that to the east and west elevations, and slightly more porous and open where you wanted to actually get a bit more daylight. This then lent us to a various series of studies to look at the various hanging options before we got to a planter pot solution that was hung within a diagrid mesh, expanded mesh, that would allow for light to percolate through, but also to rely on the greenery to actually improve the thermal performance to the east and west facades. This was actually mapped out, and what we saw without this mesh or greenery was that the average west-facing facade received direct radiation of around 700 kilowatt hours. When we added the mesh and grating and the grid structure, it actually reduced the direct radiation by 52%, but then it was enhanced further with the incorporation of the greenery by 16%. We also noted that there was an improvement in terms of glare performance. So the ability to kind of consider the external skin as a continuation of the greenery from the ground into the sky by having that continuum along the vertical surface also provided the environmental benefits of providing a bit of a shield to the harsher conditions of the tropical climate. In terms of the horizontal plane, we wanted to experience the more social and communal activities through the skycourts and the sky gardens. Children's play areas and creche areas, herb gardens that would allow us to actually grow vegetation for the on-site restaurants, swimming pools that could also be water retention areas so that the water collected could be used for the irrigation of the planting, and outdoor gymnasia and yoga decks were key for the survival and the replenishment of those activities for the workers within the building. It also had entertainment areas that could be income generating. It also had an amphitheatre deck. So all of these different spaces were not only for social betterment, but it was also an opportunity to be harvesting the additional rainwater that could be then used for irrigation of the planting. The net result was basically the ability to not only balance the existing greenery on the site, and I think it's important to note here that if you have 12 trees on a site and you were to remove the 12 trees for urban development, would we not want to be replenishing the 12 trees? Sometimes you don't have that space, but by using the green plot ratio method, you're able to still balance the quantum of greenery by looking at shrubs and vertical surfaces and diagonal surfaces in order to create that sense of equilibrium. So what was originally 1.13 in terms of green plot ratio, we were able to actually increase the greenery to 5.98 at a cost of $3 million. What this meant was that we are now able to assess the energy savings based on that additional greenery. I think that means I'm going to be wrapping up soon. I assure you that I will be finished within the next 2 minutes. So, it's almost like voiceover man. So what started out as an idea of having an environmentally performing skin has also been vertically extrapolated into social spaces in the sky. And to the conclusion. I liked what I saw earlier, Anthony. You actually had an image of the same building, and I think that we're increasingly moving away from that simple plate stacking exercise to actually something far more diverse. If we can start to imagine the lettuce being the actual vertical greenery, perhaps we're somewhere along the lines of a 24-hour mixed-use development, something that was so intrinsic within the TTDI building. We should start to think about the primary voids within the city that often permit movement far more vertically. How can the skycourt and the skygarden start helping replenish the loss of the open spaces by vertically balancing, start incorporating open lift and escalator strategies that are far more permeable and far more legible? And if the diverse city that Jane Jacobs waxed lyrical about is about the sum of the parts, then perhaps the tall building is similarly a vertical extrapolation of the city. That when we start to interlink can provide an ease of movement, and when we start greening the rooftops can actually help start to address some of those issues relating to ambient temperatures and also the enjoyment for the residents or the workers. And let us enjoy the city. Crowning it with observation decks can also be income generating opportunities for that we can then appreciate the city more. This is happening in universities around the world. University of Nottingham have a wonderful Masters of Sustainable Design course that also has a tall building component. And this is also helping us start to do more active projects within Singapore that looks at how the correlation between urban greenery and the use of space, we can start to see a correlation between greater green plot ratios and actually greater amounts of pedestrian movement. So we are yet to get to that utopian vision of the future, but somehow I think we're getting quite close to it. Let's keep on the dialogue. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you for your presentation, Mr. Professor Jason Pomeroy, and sorry about the noise during your presentation. He giving us a very considerable inspiration about new type of open space. It's not working now. Actually, now we are living in the time of internet revolution, and the concept of a conventional open space is transforming or has to be changed. So so I agree with the idea, and actually most of us act different, and we like eating individually, we play individually, and sometimes we prefer to communicate each other in cyberspace rather than real world. So I think the concept and the form of public space has to be changed. So at this point of view, he suggested a lot to us. So it's a great chance to us. And then now we are time to, oh, sorry about this. Yeah? You have some comments? Okay. So it's time to close, but we don't have much time to have a Q&A. And so actually there's some notice. You do? Yeah, okay.
It is going to be tight on timer. I think that noise we had during Jason's presentation is a sign that we really need to move on. I want to thank all the speakers for their excellent, very inspiring presentation. I think it's very good to see that sustainability can look very great as well. And we certainly had a good bite of the future to come. One little note here that was given to me that I would like to invite you all to go to the CTBUH stand and get a delegate evaluation form and fill it in, so we can make the next conference even better than this one. Again, I would like to thank the speakers. I would like to thank everybody for being here. We have a 20-minute coffee break before we move on to the next round for one final closing session. But again, thank you very much.